awesome leaders who are leading the VLA work here in Virginia. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you. This is important work for us, as literacy is personally, professionally, and part of my passion and purpose as a practicing principal right now. So thank you again, Delegate Corner, my favorite delegate, as well as our co-chair, my soror, Senator Lucas. Thank you so much for the invite, and my colleague, Gervais Siddiqui, thank you as well. And I get the pleasure of moderating a discussion with two very important leaders in this work. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Superintendent Coons, who's now our Director or Superintendent of Public Instruction for Virginia. And she will tell you a little bit about herself, but before she does, I'd like to start with the question so she can start to think about it. Superintendent Coons. As Virginia's 27th Superintendent of Public Instruction, can you share how the Virginia Department of Education currently supports students with skills necessary to be proficient in reading?
Well, I'm really excited to be here, and this is my favorite topic, which a lot of people know. I actually got to talk to superintendents a month ago about literacy, and I will talk about literacy every day, all day, if I could, because it is the great opportunity equalizer for our children. It gives every child the opportunity to be successful in their hopes and futures and dreams. So I'm really proud to be a part of Virginia, really proud to support the landmark legislation, the Virginia Literacy Act. As I talk to superintendents across the country, they're incredibly jealous of the legislation that Delegate Coiner and Senator Lucas championed through the legislature, because we have one of the most comprehensive acts in the country. And it really sets the table for all parts of literacy. It sets the table for our aspiring educators and what our aspiring educators should be prepared to do when they walk into the classroom, what our current educators should do, what they need to be trained in, how we need to help support them in the transition to brain-based science. It helps our school leaders and our superintendents vision forward what happens. And I'm so excited to present with Dr. Wilson, because probably one of the most important people in the literacy change that we're working on is our school leaders. So really excited that our school leaders are at the table and part of the conversation. And most importantly, it needs our community members, all of our stakeholders, our legislative members, our families. And so it's exciting to think about all of our stakeholders in an intentional way. And one of the things we're working on at the department this year is bringing all of those stakeholders together and putting a comprehensive set of goals for each one. We met with our superintendents and talked about, what is your literacy vision? How are you going to carry this vision forward for your school divisions? And had the opportunity for them to really think about the change that they're leading and make sure they're able to communicate to their community and support the work. And then we've started to put resources together for our principals and our school leaders about what it means to be a literacy leader in your building. What are your teachers going to need? What professional development? What time are they going to need to work together in learning communities? How are they going to need your feedback and support? So we're excited about to launch that through the department. And most importantly, we're partnering with UVA and with Dr. Solari on the professional development. We know this is not something where teachers get new textbooks and they start a different textbook series. This is actually changing fundamentally the way we teach literacy and working on brain-based science. We're able to study brains now. We're able to see what actually works in developing reading, both in breaking the code of how to read and also building vocabulary, building language, and building those comprehension skills to be successful. So that is a lot of work for our educators, and it's going to take a lot of support. So really proud of our legislation, really proud of the work across that, but we're going to have to stay the course. And that means our superintendents, our principals, our professional development leaders, our colleges and our educators all have to come together and support our children in this great work. We also need to think about our families. Our families need support. I regularly remind my daughter that those flashcards and old school things that she gets from the dollar store are not necessarily the best way to teach my grandson to read. So we need help continuing to support our families and making sure that our families feel equipped and empowered. So we have launched the Office of Parent Engagement, and they are working to put out packaging for families around literacy so we can support our families in a way that's meaningful and ways that they feel comfortable engaging. So most importantly, it is a comprehensive movement, and we have one of the best sets of legislation in the country, and we are excited to partner with all stakeholders and really put those roadmaps and plans in place and go shoulder to shoulder with our school divisions in supporting them in this long-term work.
Thank you so much. I can attest to the groundwork, the support, and listening to the voices of those in our schools. So thank you, Superintendent Coons, for being that champion of involving all stakeholders, because it is a heavy lift to really change our mindset and our practices and instruction, not only for aspiring teachers, but also for our teachers who've been doing this a while and have seen maybe 3 or 4 adoptions of programs. But I like to remind them that programs do not teach children, but teachers do. And so it is very important that you are looking and getting feedback from all stakeholders. So thank you for that. And next on this panel today with me is Dr. Solari, who is, I know her from University of Virginia. She is the champion of Virginia literacy in the university. And my question to you, Dr. Solari, is, with the passage of the Virginia Literacy Act, Virginia has one of the most comprehensive state approaches, as Superintendent Coons shared, to literacy instruction in the country. As part of the act, Virginia has convened an advisory work group to continuously assess and review implementation related to the LA. What is the working group currently focused on, and how do you see its work evolving before December 2024?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me. So the advisory work group is really meant to be a space where all the different stakeholder groups, or the folks working on the professional development, the outreach to families, the curriculum review process, can go and get feedback on those processes. So it's a diverse group of stakeholders. It has folks from all over the Commonwealth on it. Who have some expertise in literacy and have some understanding of science-based reading research and evidence-based literacy instruction. And we come together to, maybe for lack of a better term, vet what we're going to put out to all school divisions in Virginia to make sure it makes sense to different groups of folks. And this is a really important piece of our implementation and our sort of push forward for both the professional development standpoint and the curriculum review and the supporting of division and school level leaders, because we want to make sure that the content is not only correct, that it's based in science. We can do that part. UVA can do that part because that's what we do. We also have to make sure that what we're putting out makes sense to the people that we are disseminating to. So their role is to ensure and to help us sort of go through all of that content and ensure that the content is going to make sense and is going to be usable and feasible in the context of real world school settings.
So Lori, is that better? I know, I felt like I was yelling as well. Again, your work with special populations is crucially important in this implementation. And I appreciate the effort and the time that you are taking to really give us some sound research to support implementation. So at this time, I know our co-chairs are both champions of literacy. I'd like to open up the discussion for our legislators to ask questions.
Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our speakers today. I was wondering, Dr. Solari, if you could just kind of walk us through what we are seeing with our schools of education in terms of this transition, not just with the faculty who teach, who have historically taught the curricula in a certain way and are now transitioning to the new science of reading that we have in front of us, and also with the students in the School of Education programs. How is that transition going? What are some of the challenges you might have seen in this transitory period? And what kind of a timeline are we looking at as we roll it out into our various school divisions?
Thank you. That's an important question. So really, it's around the training of teachers in higher education in our ed prep program. So I work at one university, University of Virginia. I can speak to what has happened there. We made changes in our ed prep programs well before the Virginia Literacy Act to ensure that we are aligned with scientifically based reading research and evidence-based literacy instruction. And I know that there's a working group of literacy professors from all the different institutions that prepare teachers in elementary and special education. We come together typically every month, sometimes every other month, to sort of talk about the changes that need to occur across syllabi, understanding the law, the implementation of the law, and what needs to happen in the higher education space. So while I can't speak to all the different programs, there is definitely an effort by the literacy faculty across the Commonwealth to come together to ensure that we are preparing teachers in brain-based research around literacy. I think some of the challenges is that when we have folks who have been used to teaching a particular way for perhaps decades, change is difficult. This is true for K to 12. It's true for higher education. It's the same type of change pains or whatever, growing pains that you might see in K to 12 are also going to have in higher education around making those changes to ensure that everything is aligned. As far as the implementation goes, fall of 2024 is the implementation date for the VLA. So it is my understanding of the expectation is that the schools and colleges of education are teaching in an evidence-based way starting then.
Simons.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the direction we're going in with the science of reading. And I am interested in a new licensure pathway called iTeach. And I wondered if the Department of Ed had gone through to look at what curriculum they're using to make sure that it has those essential components, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and if there's the ability for these teachers to actually practice teaching reading, because I know that that's a really important component. I feel like we're bringing our universities really up to speed, and I just want to make sure if we're introducing another pathway that those iTeach students actually are getting the science of reading instruction.
Yeah, so happy to talk about that. When the board approved the iTeach program, the alternative licensure programs for some school divisions, they had the caveat that the aspiring educators also do our literacy-based requirements. So they not only have to go through the iTeach curriculum, they have to go through approved reading courses that meet the expectation of the Virginia Literacy Act. So they have to do that in addition to make sure that they're getting the same expectations as any other educator across the Commonwealth. And part of their work is that internship inside the school division, and the school division oversees that internship to make sure they're having practice. But I think that component of practice, Delegate Simmons, that you're talking about, is essential for every single teacher. We are fundamentally asking them to talk about breaking the code, practicing literacy in a different way. And I'm really proud of the quality of professional development that we're offering across the board. But one of the things that's unique to Virginia that's not common across the country is that we actually have reading specialists who go in and side by side support our educators in practice. Because all of our teachers need that practice ahead of time, but they also need that day in and day out practice and support. And that's one of the key components of the legislation, is actually having those high quality reading specialists that are supported by UVA's regional reading specialists. So we have a network of support to really support those teachers with that practice.
Follow up. So in order to become certified through iTeach, do you have to go through a school division? And that's where they get the practice from? It's from the school division?
That is correct. The school divisions applied to use iTeach as an alternative licensure program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Senator-elect Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Thank you, Senator Lucas. Can you just, it's kind of like a two-pronged question. Can you kind of talk about how PD is gonna kind of come for teachers in middle and high school? Like, is it gonna be the reading specialist in-house? Is it gonna be somebody coming into the school? And then kind of almost more importantly is, what's the oversight of that from the state level to ensure that it's being internalized? Because there's PD and then there's PD.
You start, PD.
You specifically asked about middle school or all schools? Okay. So the PD model, so this summer we trained 1,500 reading specialists across the Commonwealth in 5 different locations. We're actually in the process of training about 300 to 400 more right now, those who could not make it over the summer. And so they came to a 2-day live professional development session, and they left with coursework. So they are going through all of the reading specialists in the Commonwealth that are in elementary schools this year are going through coursework online. Sort of, it's a hybrid model. So they get the modules, they get the content, and then they also meet on a regular basis with the literacy coaches and folks at UVA, who work at UVA in our office around the content. And so that is the first step. Next year, what will happen, and next summer, moving into next fall, is the reading specialists will take the responsibility of rolling it out to the teachers. So we're making sure the reading specialists are the expert, as they should be in the building. And their responsibility is to then roll it out to everyone in their school. And some schools, in some divisions, have more than one reading specialist. This is why we had to go back and train more. We actually had overwhelming demand from the divisions for reading specialists to get into the training because they were very, very eager. So we did 1,500 over the summer. We're doing a few hundred more right now. And then those folks will go out and be it's a trainer model.
And that what we know from across the country is that the reading specialists are the experts, but your school leaders and your superintendents also have to be a part of that work to make sure implementation sticks. So one of the things we worked on with the superintendents and we're rolling out is how to support superintendents in creating that vision and that set of expectations. Then as a school leader, what are tools you can use? What are walkthrough tools? What are feedback sessions? Where are you providing lesson planning with the reading specialists and the teachers, and how do you provide those supports and structures? Because you're really changing the whole system. You're not just saying, hey, we're giving you professional development on this new strategy. You're changing a lot about what we're doing. So it takes that layer of support in that local division to really build that change management. And so the role we are taking is really to make sure our superintendents are equipped and our school leaders are equipped with the actual tools and supports, and then have time to come together and talk about how that's going to roll out and make sure that happens.
I think it would, I have 2 things that I think would be beneficial for colleagues. One would be, we all get to hear from school divisions who have not liked the old screener that we've used historically. It was outdated, and therefore some divisions look to find their own screener. Could you share with us the work that's been done to update and provide a new screener, and why we hoped that why everyone's using it for data purposes, what that means for us as legislators?
Sure, no problem. So you are correct that we have gone through over almost 3-year process now to revise the screening system. And the screening system, when it's complete, will go from pre-K, so early childhood, publicly funded early childhood classrooms through grade 3 in this first round of revisions. And then with the expansion of the Virginia Literacy Act, there will also be a screener for grades 4 to 8. So right now we're working on the pre-K to grade 3 screener. The screener, Virginia was ahead of its time when we, as a Commonwealth, adopted a universal screener for kids for literacy. And we adopted this practice started in the early 2000s. The problem that we had 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago was that the screener had never been revised. And healthy screening systems are consistently revised to make sure that they're up to date with the most current science. So we engaged in that process. And we took the most current evidence that we know about the early predictors of later reading outcomes, and we made a reliable and feasible screener for kids pre-K to grade 3. That means that we are collecting data both on the decoding side or the learning to read side of the equation, and also on language and comprehension, because the old screener only collected data on the learning to read word side, not on the comprehension part. And we know that kids need to comprehend what they're reading in order to learn how to read, in order to engage in all different content areas. So if you have to know how to read to engage in science and social studies and everything else, and you have to be able to comprehend what you're reading. So the screener will be able to detect difficulties in both learning how to read and also comprehension. And one of the most important things about a healthy screening system is that it provides instructionally relevant information for teachers. So the goal of the screener is for teachers to collect data and be able to know exactly what they need to do if a child is at risk, know how to communicate that to parents. So we're also providing a lot of family connection resources for schools. And what they need to do in the context of their own classroom in order to help kids who may be behind in early literacy.
And Delegate Coiner, I think this is really exciting because at this point in time, we have children who are in very different spaces in their reading development and post-pandemic. So having this up-to-date, nationally recognized screener helps us better understand as educators what our students really need today and what they need to be on track in the step ahead in 3rd grade. So it's really impressive work. And I know we have heard back from the field how excited they are to have this screener to truly pinpoint what our students need right now.
Yeah, and if I may just really quickly, I think something to think about is that there's not many states across the country that can say they have K to 3 or pre-K to 3 literacy data that's standardized across every single school division. It just doesn't exist. So most folks are waiting till 3rd grade to get that first snapshot with a high stakes end of year assessment, what we call the SOL assessment. And it's a real advantage to be able to know early which kids are having difficulties with literacy development.
And there's very few states, just to shout out Dr. Solari, that have a 4 through 8 screener that really helps the undercurrent of what might be happening in SOLs that you can't see in the SOL results. So we are very lucky in Virginia to have the screener work that Dr. Solari has championed.
I can give another question. That would be helpful. So as we've worked through this, one of the things that comes up and that we get to hear about as legislators are curriculum companies, right? They show up and we get to hear from folks who want to do business in Virginia. And one of the things that the data showed us was how many of our classrooms had curriculum in them that were not scientifically based to show with data that kids would learn to read, which I think we could all see the result of that by how much intervention our kids were needing in schools. And so part of our legislation put in place a review committee to ensure that any future curriculum or interventions brought into Virginia classrooms, we could feel confident that the options that are available to teachers in Virginia met high standards. And so if you could share a little bit about what that review process looks like, because it's in the legislation, but how it came to life and how that work is done I think is important for legislators, since we often hear from people when they don't like how processes go, to know that we can have faith in the system that's been set up.
Sure. So in collaboration with the department, we developed a comprehensive review process. It started with working with some experts and colleagues across the country to better understand how other states had done this work, to learn from what went well and what perhaps did not go well. From there, we developed a rubric to make sure that we had a standardized review of core curriculum, supplemental instruction, and intervention programs. The rubric was developed in collaboration with the department, but it had several groups of external reviewers. So it was reviewed by other literacy faculty across the Commonwealth. It was reviewed by literacy experts outside of Virginia. And we had feedback from K-12 educators as well. So we did a process where we developed the rubric, we got feedback, we incorporated feedback, and then we put out a call to all commercial vendors that if you wanted divisions to be able to purchase your materials in Virginia, you had to send your materials in for a comprehensive review. We have many review team members across Virginia. If you know these people, please thank them profusely. That this is really hard work to go through curriculum in a very deep level and make sure that it meets a standard, to make sure it's aligned with evidence-based practice, to make sure it's aligned with brain science, and to make sure it's also aligned with the Virginia SOLs. So it's hours and hours of time. And when we put out the call for reviewers, we were overwhelmed. Again, the response was overwhelming. People want to be engaged in this work. Our K-12 educators want to be engaged in this work. They are invested. So we interviewed every single reviewer. We made sure they knew science-based reading research and evidence-based literacy practice, and we set up different review teams. We have reviewed over 150 programs. We're in the middle of, we're not done with all 50, but we reviewed over 120 programs, both core, supplemental, and intervention programs. Last spring, we brought the first list to the Board of Education for the core programs. We brought a list very recently to the board last month for the second list of core, which we'll bring again in December. And then in the new year, we will have the list for the supplemental intervention programs. One thing I can say is we were overwhelmed by the amount of programs that were submitted, but also we should feel confident that we've had a comprehensive review because so many were submitted. At the same time, there's a track for our divisions who have curriculum materials that they have themselves developed in-house. We are also reviewing those to make sure that they meet the same standard of what we mean by evidence-based literacy instruction aligned with scientifically based reading research. So if you have a program that was developed within your division and you want our review teams to review it, we have done so. We're working with those divisions individually to review those programs as well.
Senator Hashmi and then Senator-elect Van Valkenburg.
Thank
Did
you,
you get
Madam.
your question answered?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm beginning to hear from the localities that I represent some concern around funding, and this is really a question for our superintendent. The concerns are that federal and some of the flexible state funding now is going to be used for the purposes of covering the re-benchmarking over the next 2 years. And so the concerns are, if you could walk us through where the localities are going to be able to get the funding to implement the VLA, but also to hire reading specialists. I know when we had the Senate Finance Retreat what was it, 2 weeks ago, there was considerable concern about the tightening of our budgets, especially around education. So if you're able to forecast where is the funding going to come from, how are we going to roll it out, to what degree are the localities going to be responsible for hiring this additional supports staff that we need?
Sure. The flexible funding, we have received 122 of 131 school divisions, and all of them have put some significant money over the next 3 years to make sure they can support the material purchases that are in place. And most of them, it looks like in their ESTR charge off, are also focusing towards those one-time purchases of curricular and curricular materials. We are funded in the K-5 space for their reading specialists, and are currently staffed where they have told us they are staffed. I can't speak to the re-benchmarking and whether or not that will play into the funding of literacy specialists as they're still finalizing the components of the re-benchmarking formula. But we will continue to focus on and encourage our school divisions to think about that flexible funding. And I do think the board is making some recommendations around flexible funding, around where they provide those reading specialists. We are hearing a pretty diverse need around what they want and need around the Literacy Act, and want to make sure we're supporting what the local needs are in school divisions and that they have the flexibility to do that.
I saw a hand, but I don't know.
Not, I can
Senator
ask
Hodgman
another
has another question if someone else, if nobody else is in queue.
Thank you for your indulgence in letting me ask another question. So I know the degree to which it's really critical to involve parents, and I believe Dr. Solari, you mentioned the role that parents are going to be playing. Can we talk a little bit about the ways in which we are deliberately engaging parents in the process, helping them to helping to educate them on how to engage more effectively with their children, especially young children, in supporting their reading efforts?
I think we can both talk about family engagement for sure. We are really excited. Actually, you have several members of the PTA behind you, and we've been working closely with them to engage in packaging resources. Our Office of Parent Engagement has been reaching out and developing packages. One thing we know is that our families have diverse needs, and asking our families to lean in to be reading instructors is not where we want our families to have support. We want to have resources around language development, about opportunities to read, time together, and allowing our families to do that. So we are putting packages together, getting some feedback from a variety of sources, and should have a great deal of those resources. And then Dr. Solari, you also have several resources that you've launched as well.
Yep. Yeah. So the part of the reading specialist training this summer, we provided all the reading specialists with several, essentially a school year long packages of literacy nights for families. So they could take the package, go back to their local school division, and we worked with them to train them on how do you engage families around literacy. And we have had really good feedback. Those are being used currently in elementary schools across the Commonwealth. And we will continue to support our reading specialists in that way through the literacy coaches that are at UVA. They are supporting the local reading specialists to engage with families. Around the screener, we have developed several different resources that go directly to teachers. So the teachers are the ones collecting the data for the literacy screener, and so that they can effectively communicate with families when children might be having difficulties or they might not be meeting those early benchmarks. And then the third thing that we've done is on our website at UVA, we have several resources directed towards families about what is evidence-based literacy instruction, what is a reading screener, What should I do if my child is having difficulties? And those are free and publicly available. They've been there for over a year. And we are encouraging the reading specialists to let parents and families know that they can come to that site for some simple information. And we also have provided the reading specialists and school leaders one pages or infographics on literacy development they can take, and they can put it up in their school, and they can get more information that way as well.
And I think, Dr. Sklar, you make a good point for our families. A lot of the assessment data is very hard to read and understand. And Delegate Coiner, we've been working on the parent work group about creating parent portals and making sure that our assessments and the data that comes back from the assessments are friendly to families, that families can use them, they can understand them. So one of the things we've asked our assessment vendor this year is to rewrite all the parent reports that go home and make sure those have QR codes, and that will start with the winter VGA data so that those are parent friendly, but we're hoping to launch that parent portal and create a one-stop shop for our families so they have more easily accessible resources to support their needs.
Thank you. Senator Favola? After Senator Favola, we're gonna go back to Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe you covered this earlier, and my apologies if you have, but some of us have school districts with large proportions of students who are learning English as a second language. And their families are not necessarily proficient in English. So this whole, reading based on science and using resources in the family and the community to, bolster our children. I hope that there's some guidance in here or some support for the school systems that are really facing unique challenges. In Arlington, we have 126 different languages spoken in our schools. And a fair number of our children, like I said, even through high school, are learning English as a second language. So if you could speak to some of the support structure that might be in place for a school system such as Arlington.
The research. Okay. So I think it's important to note some research on this, right? So on English learners, it's one of the areas where I research literacy development. And what we know from the data is that instructional protocols and instructional approaches that are effective for monolingual English students are also effective for English learners. The data have shown that over and over and over again. Okay. This is particularly true. Well, this is true in most languages that we encounter in the United States. And there's a lot of data that I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested in that. When we developed the screening system, and I understand there's 126 languages, we, at the same time as developing the English screening system, we have also developed a Spanish screening system because it is a large proportion of children in Virginia who speak a language other than English, it is Spanish. So that will be available for divisions who choose to use it very soon with the rollout of the English one. And so I think and the other thing is the parent engagement piece, which is really important. What we've done in our office at UVA is we've translated out everything for parents into Spanish. We did that immediately because we have folks on our team who can do that. And then we have also in the past year translated into several different languages. Those are all available on our website. Because sometimes, having worked in schools, and I speak English and Spanish, but that's it. If I have a parent who I can't necessarily communicate with, it's really nice to have something that I can put in their hands and sort of talk through that is in a language that they can understand and read and digest. So we are trying to get many languages in our parent and family resources that we have at the UVA website, and we will continue to do that. It's not the perfect solution. There are definitely there's more need out there, but also it's really important to understand that we know the instructional approaches that are evidence-based for monolingual children are the same for children who are English learners.
That's
And I think one of the most important things are using things like QR codes, translated languages, videos to make sure that we're reinforcing that across the board. Because even though we have English learners, we also have family members who they may be non-readers. So we want to provide those resources and those options to engage. And I think having that screener in multiple languages, having resources. I will also say the curriculum guides that Dr. Solari has created calls out some of those specific practices to reinforce with our English learners. As we look at implementations and supporting our school leaders, we'll be supporting them looking at how are you engaging all language learners in the classroom and when you walk through. So we're at that front end, but it's important to carry that thread all the way through, all the way down to our school leaders and our teachers and support them with implementation.
Any further questions by members of the legislature? If not, we're 15 minutes ahead of time and we'll yield that time back over to the moderator, Ms. Sorrow.
Thank you so much. I have one final question for both of our panelists. Given the audience that you have before you today, what additional programs and policies might policymakers and state legislators explore to ensure that evidence-based literacy instruction is supported across Virginia?
I think Virginia is in a unique place. There's a significant piece of the VLA. It's one of the only legislation that goes all the way through 8th grade. But we know that that policy is incredibly important, but the actual change that happens when it hits the school divisions, when it hits the classrooms, when our teachers are being asked to do something different, that's a long-term shift. That's a long-term process. And it's important for us to continue to think about the processes, the support, the fiscal resources that will be necessary to support that change management. So I think we've got great statute, we've got great code. Now it's about that implementation and support of all the great pieces and putting them together to make sure every child learns to read.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think it's important to thinking about staying the course. And maybe it's a little bit different than what you were just saying, but make sure we're staying the course because this change is going to take multiple school years. This is a 3 to 5 to 7 year shift. We are asking principals, reading specialists, and teachers in some cases to fundamentally change their practice. At the same time that we are implementing a new screening system and there is more expectation that teachers and reading specialists are communicating with parents and implementing new curriculum in some places. So we're asking for a lot. It's not going to go perfectly in every single site in the first couple of years. And so we may hear some grumbling, but it's really important to stay the course. Folks who work in school divisions know that when we swing back and forth from one curriculum to the next, that does not serve children, and it also doesn't serve teachers. So making sure that we understand that this is not a quick fix. This is a long-term implementation plan, and we need to make sure that we are committed to staying the course.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists, and I believe
Madam
my
Moderator,
directions.
I'm sorry to interrupt,
Mhm.
but my senator to the left, Senator Barker, does have another question.
All right. One of the things I think that I've wondered about, and that is the learning loss that we had among a lot of elementary school children who would not continue reading at the level that they were, and sometimes it would be reduced in terms of how they would test on things. How can we work with the systems that you're moving in to get them back to where they should have been? So
First, I want to thank the General Assembly because you put funds in place for our school divisions to be able to do this. And they have really risen to the occasion. It's impressive. We have been in school divisions all over the country. It feels like all over the country because there's several thousand miles on our car, but all over the Commonwealth, and really excited about them. Some school divisions are using their teachers and pulling small groups of tutoring during the day. Some of them are pulling retired educators, aspiring educators, community members to provide tutoring, but they're really providing additional time on those literacy practices. As Dr. Solari said, her team is reviewing supplemental and intervention materials, and those materials are critical. We're also providing a free resource across the state. We have Lexia and Ignite for literacy and Zern for mathematics that school divisions can use, but they're really building programs that make sense within their community. If they're struggling to staff, they're using alternative educators. We have an alternative tutoring where anyone can sign up. Please sign up and tutor, and the school divisions can go in and tap into that tutoring resource. But it's that additional time with the evidence-based instruction that Dr. Solari talked about that we want to make sure that those kiddos have, because we don't want them to be struggling readers in 8th grade and in high school, because that doesn't allow them to access the great programming that's available. We want to make sure we're catching them up in real time with both that decoding and that learning how to read, but also a lot of our children didn't have the opportunity to build language, build vocabulary, build experiences. So how are we providing that? How are we supporting that with our tutors and making sure that that comprehensive literacy approach is happening in those tutoring sessions, in those small groups? And one of the keys to that is that screener that Dr. Solari talked about, really pinpointing what our students need, understanding where their gaps are, and making sure we're filling up those gaps so that they can access their grade level curriculum. So very thankful for those opportunities.
One last question on our side, Delegate Rasul.
Yes, thank you, Senator Lucas. Thank you all for your presentation and great information. And we certainly love when people are giving us such great compliments about the money we put in, the extra supplemental money, to kind of piggyback off of Senator Hashmi's comment. The concern that we have, that we're hearing from school divisions, is in some of the calculations being offered, we see some of that extra money supplanting the re-benchmarking dollars. So every 2 years we go through, we re-benchmark. And so we're just worried and want to make sure that the extra money that we gave you is protected. And we as a body in the General Assembly will be doing everything that we can to do that. But my question is, I have heard at least for the better part of this decade, you know, the correlation when we talk about 3rd grade reading levels and what that means. I think what I'm not sure about is beyond the correlation, what other factors, especially what you're seeing, Dr. Solari, should we really be looking at as far as comprehensively beyond 3rd grade reading levels of how our students are going to be doing at graduation? And sometimes I will say what the feeling is there's a fixation on this metric, and at the expense of the kind of holistic view. And I would love your expertise from all of you, but your expertise as, hey, here are the top 5 things, the top 3 things, in addition to their 3rd grade reading levels that we really need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and this is a really important question. So we hear a lot about the relationship between 3rd grade reading levels and maybe high school graduation or whatever it may be, college entrance. You know, from a data standpoint, it is predictive. So where kids are in 3rd and 4th grade, it does predict whether or not they are going to graduate high school. And it has for decades. But I think it's also really important to think of context and community when we talk about this. When I talk about reading science, I like to say out loud, because I think it's important, that children learn how to read, not brains. So the brain is really important in learning how to read. There's no doubt about that. We know how the brain works when children are learning how to read and write. But also, there are so many contextual factors surrounding children that some of which we can control and some we can't at all. So the things that we can control are the instructional programs that they get, So is a child who reaches third grade and doesn't know how to read, is everything out the window for that child? Absolutely not. But they have to be receiving high intensity, evidence-based literacy instruction in order to catch them up. We know that they're at a disadvantage. Is it over? No, absolutely not. We never want to think about children in that way, right? Or the teachers who teach them. So there are things we can control and things we can't. Curriculum we can control, the way in which we work with families, we can control the community members. We can control classroom environments. So is the classroom that the child is coming into welcoming, and is the teacher want to be there with that child and is engaged with that child? So and motivation is another part of this. So how are we working with our third and fourth graders who are having difficulties learning how to read? You have to understand that if you get to third and fourth grade and you're having a difficult time learning how to read, reading is very frustrating for those kids. And if we don't do our best to intervene at that point, it's going to be a lifelong frustration. And I don't know about everyone in this room, but I don't love to do the things that I'm not good at, right? So we need to understand both the academic side of it, which is learning how to read, but the social, emotional, behavior side of it as well. That might not be 5 things, but it's what I tend to think about, sort of the academic part, extremely important, evidence-based instruction important, but our children are learning in very diverse contexts and communities, and we have to understand that as well.
That was a great question, Delicate Rizal. And I think one of the things talking about kids being frustrated after third grade, the important piece of legislation with the screener continuing in 4th through 8th grade, as we talked with colleagues around the country who are also focused on this issue, we're the first state to do a 4th through 8th grade screener, and everyone else is now chasing after us. But you know, the reason it's so important is because it is very frustrating once you leave third grade and when you get into middle school, if you don't have all of the same skills as folks who are on grade level. And we have not had a tool that our teachers can use to pinpoint the areas that need the most focus as fast as possible, right? Our SOL just simply tells us you aren't reading on grade level. It doesn't give us the explicit areas that that particular child needs the most focus on. So we will have reading specialists, we will have interventions that are guaranteed to work. And for the first time ever, our students who are still struggling will have detailed data to show where they need support and help. And we've guaranteed through the legislation that they are offered that help over the summer, which a lot of our divisions do, but it's never been required. So we can know that families are being offered that help. So that's one of those things. And it's not a quick fix. When we looked at, Senator Lucas and I looked at data of other states who went before us in the K-3 space, you know, it's predicted it takes about 7 years to fully realize the impact. If you think about how many grade levels of kiddos have to go through before you start seeing it across every grade level. So it is that stay the course long-term work, but great work from everybody on the 4th through 8th grade screeners.
Well, as it turns out, I didn't have any time to yield back to you anyway. We're about 5 minutes, 5 minutes and done. But now I will turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you so much. If I can just add one last point to that, please don't forget in that list of challenges, like Dr. Solari stated, we're dealing with children, teaching them how to read, not the brain, but also our school teachers and our school leaders, our principals, who are there to really try to offset the challenges of engagement, as well as attending school with our kids who are already struggling in an area that's so critical. So thank you again for an awesome discussion and for continuing to lead the way in Virginia. And I believe I am turning it back over to Delegate Coiner, who will transition the group.
I don't think I am. Go ahead.
Do I have a mic? Hello, sorry. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you all being here and are immensely grateful for the great work you're doing for our young readers. So thank you so much. With that, we are going to transition to a 15-minute break for all of you, well-deserved break. For our legislators in the room, we do have snacks and drinks available for you on the wall. We will reconvene at 2:30 for our next session, which will focus on school funding and finance. And one final update for you all, we will be providing a key takeaways summary of the conversations that you're hearing today. It will include links to any resources that our resource experts have shared with you. So please take all the notes you need, but know that our team will also be compiling that document for you. Enjoy your break, and we'll be back at 2:30.
that will be renumbered to the 74th, representing all of the city of Colonial Heights and the southern tier of Chesterfield County. As a member of the Education Committee and being an educator, this next subject is very, very important to me, but I would be remiss. We've had some late breaking news while we've been in this today, and if you haven't had a moment to jump on Twitter, I would like to say congratulations to our colleague here in the room. Delegate Sam Rasool has been nominated and will be the education chair in the coming session. So congratulations, Delegate Rasool.
While you're making
Legislative
announcements,
Audit Review Commission. Yep, go ahead,
while you're
Senator.
making those announcements, I'd like to announce the next chair for Senate Education and Health is Senator Hashmi.
There we go. Chair for both committees here with us. How awesome is that? In July, the Joint Legislative Audit Review, JLARC Commission, presented the culmination of a 2-year study shedding light on the way we fund public education in Virginia and how this compares to other states. The landscape of education is ever evolving, and our funding sources and strategies must adapt to meet the needs of the students and the educators. This is an opportunity for us to continue to improve the Commonwealth's education system. Today's conversation will inspire dialogue about how we as policymakers should respond to these findings, explore best practices in other states, and understanding the intricate connection between funding and accountability. You see, it's one thing when we wonder where there's a problem. It's something else entirely when we are told there's a problem and now we must find the appropriate solution. JLARC told us there is an issue. Now it's up to us to find the solution. Leading this conversation will be Katrina Miller, Director of Educational Partnerships at SAS. Katrina, will you introduce our panel?
Yes, thank you, Delegate Cherry, and thank you for having us today. We have the privilege of talking about one of everyone's favorite topics, which is funding formulas. I know we're super excited to talk about that. I talk about being a self-professed data nerd, so I'm often on panels where we talk about data and understanding what's going on with students. And so this morning, or earlier today, right after lunch, I heard someone say that good policy and good decisions happen through good data. And I love that. And today we're going to bring that philosophy as we talk about funding, what we know about funding in Virginia and across the country, how it's playing out here. And I have the privilege of working with several states on bringing transparency to that conversation of not only what's going into the funding of schools and divisions across the United States, but how those funds are being spent and utilized most specifically to impact student outcomes and student learning. So I'm really excited to be on the cusp of this discussion in Virginia. I think that you all have tackled some really big problems over the last few years. We just heard about your nationally known literacy initiative. So I think we'll all be watching as you tackle the issue of funding. What we know in funding is that most people think that the majority of funding comes from the federal government. And as legislators, I know most of you are aware that that's just not the case. About 45% of school funding comes from the local level with local property taxes. The other 45% comes from state funds, which all of you all are directly responsible for and have oversight over. And only about 10% comes from the federal government. Virginia ranks about in the middle of the pack when it comes to funding for schools, and we're going to hear from Dr. Marguerite Rosa, who is a national expert on school funding from the Edunomics Lab, and then Justin Brown, who oversaw the JLARC report that was mentioned earlier, to provide a little bit more context about what's going on in your state. So without further ado, we'll get started, and we'll start with Dr. Rosa, who again is the director of the Edunomics Lab and a research professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. She often speaks about funding throughout the U.S. and I think has some eye-opening data to share, especially as it relates to the influx of funding from the COVID relief dollars and the cliff that schools will be facing in the coming year. So Dr. Rosa, Virginia utilizes a hybrid funding model for its school, taking aspects of both staff and resource-based formulas to fund its education system. Most states are either fully resource-based or fully student-based. Can you share a bit about how this funding system works and perhaps some strengths and weaknesses to this approach?
First, so actually, I think every state's kind of hybrid. By hybrid, we mean we've layered on different funding streams on top of each other and assume they all work out. It's just that in Virginia, a bigger chunk of the money is in basically essentially a staffing or a research-based formula. So first of all, most states now don't do that anymore. That's outdated. Most states fund schools based on the number and type of kids they have. Kids are the constant in schooling, right? Different school districts have different models, different delivery strategies, different approaches to meet their challenges. The one thing they have in common is they have kids. So in California, for instance, there's a dollar amount, let's just say it's $11,000 that every district gets for each of their kids, plus an extra, I think it's more like $4,000 for each kid that is living in low income settings or an English language learner or a foster kid. And no one's curious if their school district got robbed or cheated out of the state system because everybody knows those numbers. And everybody knows that the state has put a big priority on high poverty kids, on English language learners, because they come with a fixed dollar amount for each and every one of those extra kids. So that's not actually how it works here. In fact, I'd be hard pressed if there were even 3 people in here who knew exactly how Virginia's works. Yes, I know you know. Okay, so I
forgot it already.
Yeah, okay, maybe no people. Anyway, but if somebody was saying, how come my district gets this amount of money? The district doesn't really know because the formulas are overlapping and contradictory and offsetting and changing each year and benchmarked up and affected by cost of living and this, that, and the other, such that you have 2 different districts with similar kids getting pretty different amounts of money in the state of Virginia. So I will point out that the sum total of that is that the system is not transparent, it is not equitable, and maybe most importantly, the thing we can see from the data is it's not working. And I know that's kind of a lot there, but all you'd have to do would be to look at the spending versus outcomes. And I know everybody can't see this, but what you would see, and we'll send this out, is a data site where you can look up different kinds of elementary schools, high schools, high poverty schools, low poverty schools. And what the data looks like is a big scatter plot where there's almost no relationship whatsoever between the money and the outcomes. And that's what I mean by it's not working. We want to be able to put in an incremental dollar and get an incremental benefit for kids. Each time we spend a little bit more, we'd like to see more value for students. And that's what we would see when we have a robust relationship between spending and outcomes. And so Virginia is a long way from that. And if the legislature had the appetite to fix the funding formula, it would take a lot of people getting involved in this. You would require, what are we going to fund going forward? Are we going to fund student test scores? Are we going to fund class sizes? Are we going to fund staffing, cost of living, what you got last year, how much your change in your staff costs? Are we going to fund counselors or other kinds of inputs? Or are we going to fund students? That would be a big first decision. I would recommend the latter, that we fund students. Then you would have to decide, how are we going to use the local money? Do we want to make sure the local money contributes to a target? That's what most states do. They say, we know you can raise this much, we'll give you the difference. That allows the state money to stretch a little further and make sure you have that equity across schools. Then the next thing you'd have to say is, which students do we want to add higher dollar amounts for and by how much? That's easy. Look at your data. If your low-income students aren't performing as well as your more affluent ones, it may be the case you haven't spent enough on them. If your English language learners are lagging throughout the state compared to your other students, Maybe that's a place where you need to put some more money. And then you send that signal to the districts. Then you've got to decide what data are we going to collect and what we're going to do for accountability. Because right now, even in the state of Virginia, I just looked it up right before I came up here, a district where the kids are 4 years behind the national average. 4 years behind the national average. I don't even know how you could test that low. And this is not a tiny little itty bitty district. It's a real district. And the question is, what are we doing if we put money in and it doesn't work? Are we going to go in and change something? Are we going to invalidate decisions they've made in the past? Are we going to send the kids somewhere else? Or are we going to leave them there year after year? So that accountability piece is another decision that has to be made. And then the last piece is that transition. How do you get from where we are to the new model? Because you can't upset the apple cart overnight. So I'm happy to talk about any of those. That's just my opening piece there.
Thank you. Justin, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, JLARC, recently published a report on the standard of quality funding formula used in Virginia. What major recommendations for the funding formula can you highlight for the policymakers present today?
I think I'd focus on three things. The first is that, we developed some objective criteria and we just compared each part of the formula to that objective criteria. And pretty much across the board, and this kind of is very consistent with what the good professor is saying, the formula falls pretty short. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we tried to create a blueprint for the legislature if it wanted to make the current formula, let's call it better, some near-term and long-term recommendations, a bit of a blueprint there. But then the other thing I want to focus on a little bit is this idea of you could go with something different, and that probably could be a student-based model. So let me just touch on those three themes briefly. As I mentioned, we're an analytical group, so we wanted to create some criteria to kind of objectively evaluate the formula. And so we did that. And we looked at kind of how other states evaluated their formulas. We looked at some prior work that had been done here in Virginia. And the criteria we put together was things like, is the formula itself and the assumptions and the inputs, is that based on something kind of clear and justifiable that you can explain? And I think the scatter plot that the professor held up kind of shows why you want there to be some basis for it, because if you don't, it's not going to make much sense. But so having something that's kind of clear and justifiable, it needs to have some relationship to what's actually happening in a school or school division. A lot of times it's called prevailing practice. We also wanted to just make sure that it was accurate and that it was transparent. We had some other criteria as well, but I just wanted to hit on a few things where the current formula falls short in a pretty major way when you compare it to the criteria. So in terms of the first part of the formula, it really just tries to estimate how many staff each division needs, and then collectively how much the Commonwealth needs. And the formula estimates that you need about 114,000 staff. But when you go and kind of look at school divisions, they're employing about 170,000. So the formula assumes that divisions only need about 2/3 of the staff they actually have. The other thing that we want to take a look at was the other kind of major driver of what the formula produces are the salary and benefit costs. As most of you know, schools and school divisions, the bulk of their budget is for salaries and benefits. Their job is primarily to employ a workforce. And the formula includes, frankly, a fairly arcane statistical methodology to lower the value of the outliers in terms of salaries. And if the distribution was kind of flat, or what we would call a normal distribution, that may not be a problem. But in reality, we know that the distribution isn't normalized. Divisions that employ the most teachers tend to be in the high-cost parts of the state, so they tend to pay higher salaries. So when you kind of artificially depress the value of the high and the low, you're really downgrading what a lot of the large divisions that employ most teachers have to actually pay. So then you take the artificially low number of staff and you multiply it times the artificially low salary calculation, and you kind of produce a comparatively low number relative to this criteria. The other thing we're really picking on this formula here, but when you look at how it kind of measures low income, at-risk kids. It falls pretty short there. It's using a really outdated measure of low income students, and that produces a pretty big gap. Special education is an area of difficulty. And one thing I think whenever I try to talk to legislative groups in particular, but also school divisions, is emphasize that we have very large divisions. Fairfax County on its own would be, I think it's in the top 20 largest divisions in the country. But most divisions are fairly small, and most of them are pretty rural. And the formula right now kind of penalizes small divisions because it's very difficult for them to kind of achieve any types of efficiency through what you would call economies of scale. A medium-sized or large division, it has fixed costs, and it can, as it has more students, it could kind of spread those costs over a large group of students. Small divisions can't do that. So the formula right now, frankly, it penalizes small divisions, particularly when you get under 2,000 students, because of that disadvantage they have in terms of economies of scale. So the second thing I'd focus on in terms of this blueprint we have for if you want to fix the current formula, we identified some near-term things that we felt like just on its face, it would be difficult for us not to say you need to probably fix this right away. Then we had some longer-term changes that would be kind of big policy decisions or frankly, just very large amounts of money. I think I'm sure you've covered it in earlier parts of this session, but when you add up everything in Virginia, it's well over $20 billion in terms of the total spend in K-12. So even a small change is going to have a pretty big budget impact. But we had kind of a menu of things that you could do. So the at-risk component, I think you could shore that up using FY23 as a base. We estimated that would be about $250 million, not cheap. But then we had some other recommendations that in the world of K-12, I think are fairly common sense and maybe not as expensive. For example, you could kind of fix that flaw in the formula that penalizes the small divisions. And we estimated based on the FY23 data, that would cost $90 to $100 million. But over the long term, if you wanted to do it, there's some pretty heavy lift things. For example, to kind of count all the staff that the divisions have and include that in the formula, you're talking between $1.5 and $2 billion, but because of the gap. So that's a heavy lift. The final thing I would flag, and I'm not going to say much about this because I think we've already touched on it, but I think the choice is you can dig into this current formula and do a lot of things to try to improve it, or you can do what most states do and not have such a complex input-based formula. You can go to the student-based model. And I think there's a lot of advantages. We talked about transparency, which is important. I think it's not as complicated to maintain over time. It's been 20 plus years since there was a real review of this funding formula. And I think part of the reason why we found so many problems with it was because it had been so long since a comprehensive look was taken at it. Student-based formulas, because they tend to be less complicated, it's easier to maintain them over time, and they certainly are more understandable. And I guess, I think from an appropriator's perspective and maybe from budget office people or money committee staff, the notion that you have to kind of send a request over to the Department of Education and they kind of crank the black box model and then you get this result back about if we put this much in, here's what we'll get out of it. The student-based model doesn't have any of those challenges. So I think there can be quite a bit of appeal to it, and that's why most other states do something like that. So in a nutshell, those would be the three key takeaways I would have.
Thank you both. I think you've given our group here quite a bit to think about. We would love to hear your questions now, so I'll turn it over to Delegate Coiner and Senator Lucas for questions.
Yes, I think Delegate Rasul, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for your thoughts. My question is, it makes logical sense intuitively to think about potentially funding schools through a student-based formula as opposed to a staffing-based formula. However, I wonder, when we think about the fixed costs associated with running a school, you just alluded to the economies of scale that are a struggle for some of these school divisions currently within the current formula. The most constructive question would be, what do other states do in a student-based funding formula that ensure that there's equity built in for these smaller school divisions so that way they can cover their fixed costs appropriately?
I'm happy to jump in. So some states add money for smallness of districts, some don't. Where the states add money for small districts, their small districts cost more. Where the states don't add money for small districts, they don't cost more. So that it's really as blunt as that. It would look from the data that there really aren't fixed economies of scale that plague school districts, that's an artifact of our thinking about every school and district needs a specific complement of staff. So if you start with the idea that every school needs a full-time librarian and a full-time PE teacher and a full-time counselor, a vice principal and a principal, then you get really expensive small schools on a per pupil basis. But across the country, many smaller schools aren't run that way. The principal maybe teaches a class, or the school district has a PE teacher who's also something else. My own kids went to one of those small schools. It was excellent. The school district did PE actually very differently. The school, it was very, very small, so much so that they even used a digital class for things like AP Econ, whereas this big school they went to before didn't have it. So I will say that the economies of scale is the recipe framework of schooling that a lot of states have essentially abandoned, that where the legislature knows the recipe that has to go into every school district, and the school districts don't have to think about that because the legislature has already done it. And I want to make this point because it comes from an example in Virginia from a deputy superintendent that I was talking to, who said what I was talking about ESSER funds and how we should try to leverage them to get the maximum value for students. And he said, this thing you're doing, this economist thing where you're thinking about how to get the best value for kids from your investments, we don't do that. We get the money from the state and we spend it on the things that the state suggests we spend it on. Sometimes we ask our teachers what they want and we give them that. But that mindset around the continuous improvement mindset around trying to explore how each incremental dollar will deliver more value for kids, that's in conflict with this idea that there is a set of inputs that everybody should fund and everybody should have, and we don't have to think about it past that. So one is a compliance mindset, and the other one is what we call a continuous improvement mindset. But we generally, it's a choice. If the state wants to put more money into its small districts, it can. It doesn't suggest data-wise across the country that you have to.
I think that the struggle that we have is, when I talk to a school district in deep Southwest Virginia, and I compare the curriculum with, let's say, Arlington, there's just a world of difference in what's being offered. And to me, there's an equity issue there that isn't going to be solved with the principal teaching Spanish. Now, that's not necessarily what you're saying, but I think we're trying, and I think there are two things to give you here for sure, that technology can play a role in this, because there are certainly classes that could be taught remotely that could, certainly improve things as we move forward. But I think this is part of the struggle in the conversation. And then the second part that you had mentioned, which I think is important, is that there is a transition period. And I think that will be very important in Virginia to determine how we ease on into any future funding model, because what we do agree on is that there needs to be some improvements. So this is the tug and pull that hits us, I think, on a daily basis.
I mean, one other thing, in across the country, bigger isn't necessarily better for school districts. It's kind of, there almost are like some diseconomies of scale where the district gets so big, it like debates these bigger, socio political issues instead of focusing on some of the basics. But I will say, if you look across the state and you notice that rural kids are underperforming urban ones, You could say, fine, we should have a weight for rural students. That's a student characteristic. They live in a rural neighborhood. So you can do that anyway, regardless of the size of the school division. If across the board, you're seeing a regular pattern where rural students are underperforming, which isn't also unusual, in part because it can be very hard to attract and retain really good talent to rural communities, even if the cost of living is lower.
Delegate Bullivan?
Yeah, thank you. So this has been really helpful so far as far as being able to kind of look at the ramifications of the JLARC study. And I guess in terms of the student-based approach, to simplify it, if I understand, there's the per pupil funding. There is the additional money in specific categories where you have some accountability associated with it to make sure that you're getting the outcomes that you're hoping to get. And then there is the local level of funding. And I guess I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on two things, which is how do you determine the local amount without sliding back into something like an LCI, which is imperfect, you know, and also to account for the fact that you've got some localities, you know, that can give a certain amount and do, and some that can give a certain amount and don't. So how do you parse those out? And then the second part is I am interested in the what does accountability look like? You know, so recognizing our Constitution provides a certain structure and assigns particular responsibilities all the way down to the school division level. What does that accountability ultimately look like from a state fiduciary standpoint?
Maybe I'll talk a little bit and then you can chime in. Maybe I'll take the last part first. It's interesting in terms of thinking about accountability. The standards of quality, a lot of people jump right to standard 2, which is the discussion of kind of staffing and resources. But as I'm sure you probably know, there's a lot of other standards as well. And there's been a lot of discussion, for example, lately in terms of do we have the right standards of accreditation for schools? There's a whole kind of set of rules and structures around that. So I think it's, to your point, I think it's important to not forget about, as it was originally written and intended, the standards of quality are more than just the funding formula. Now, in terms of how you address that, in terms of where the rubber meets the road, I think that's where it gets challenging. Do you have a philosophy of, do you provide additional resources to divisions with students that chronically underperform? Or do you have a model like we have right now where based on a certain kind of accreditation standard or criteria, you're kind of moved over here and you're forced to work with the Department of Education? We looked into that 2 or 3 years ago and found that approach at the time was pretty outdated and not very effective, and had some recommendations to improve that. So I think my point is, dealing with accountability and funding at the same time, I think, is hard. They clearly are both relevant. And I'm not even going to talk about accountability for staff and teachers, but some people talk about that as well. But so I think it's difficult to do it, but they're all under the standards of quality. I don't know if you'd want to add anything to that about the student-based model, but
yeah, I think in the student-based model, the accountability, the school division or school district owns the accountability piece, right? Like they're accountable because in a model like the one you have in Virginia, the state owns it because the state already made a bunch of the decisions on what the school districts need to do. So they could look at the state and go, don't look at me. We said exactly what you told us in terms of staffing and everything else. We went through the motions, not our fault if the kids didn't perform well. Whereas in if you funding school districts on a per pupil basis, plus additional increments for low income kids, now you can go compare across school districts and say, you got this much money, which is the same exact amount they got. Your kids are underperforming, something is wrong. And you can run through the data. I mean, we do it at our team all the time, and we know exactly which districts are SOS Mayday districts right now. One of the things we find is we go to those schools and districts, they don't know that. They think they've been in compliance the whole time. So our first step would be massive amounts of transparency over which schools and students are, not students really in that way, but which schools with which types of students are underperforming. Right now, if you go to the schools, they'll say, well, we didn't get our share of the money because the state gave a lot more to them. And they don't feel any accountability on that. So we would say that transparency, excellent communication on that, absolutely more training for the leaders, because we have leaders in school districts who don't know that their school district or their school is underperforming. And that's another piece that should go with any funding formula reform, is a mandate for administrators to have training on being the stewards of these public funds. And I know you asked some other ones. I thought they were JLARC questions.
Well, this gets really complicated, but in chapter 9 of our rather lengthy report, we had kind of an example for the things that you would put in a student-based formula and kind of how you might transition from what we have to the different categories you would have. And so we try to kind of notionally walk that out. But it's interesting hearing the professor speak. There's clearly a lot of flexibility in how that can be done. And I think there's frankly some latitude that legislatures and governors can exert in terms of what they want to emphasize in that formula. But we try to lay that out a little bit in chapter 9 of the written report. And I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards too.
I'm trying to figure out who was first. I think I'm gonna go with Senator Edwards first, Senator-elect Van Valkenburg, and whose hand did I see on this? Delegate Durant, and then Senator Favola. Do you all remember your order? And then it's gonna be Senator Barker. Remember your order.
John,
Senator Edwards, you are first.
okay, JLARC study. I've been reading what you said here. You just said adjust the appropriation language to equally weight student enrollment and general population demographics when calculating the local composite index for divisions. And also replace the local composite index with a revenue capacity index. That makes sense, a student-based formula as opposed to something else. How much would that cost and how would it be done? I gather we are underfunding schools in Virginia compared to other states. So explain that. I think you got something there. If this replace local composite index with a revenue capacity index. I think that's the key to it.
Sure, we'd be happy to talk about that. It's interesting. I kind of have come to think is K-12 policy is kind of the formula designates the size of the funding pie, if you will, and whether you use the local composite index or something like a revenue capacity index, that determines how the pie is divided up. So what we found with the local composite index, despite the fact that it's been around for about 50 years, it's not that far off relative to some of the other things in the formula. However, to your point, it assumes that every locality has the same proportion of revenue by type. And so if you went to a revenue capacity index, that wouldn't really change the overall amount of money, but it would shift kind of within the pot of money that's allocated across some of the divisions. And it made sense to us to have it as an option because the local composite index is not fundamentally broken, but there are some pretty big differences, as you know, across the state in terms of the revenue base. So going to that, I think would make some sense. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards as well. But on our website, we actually showed for every jurisdiction what that would mean in terms of their revenue.
The problem in Virginia is Northern Virginia is very wealthy. Western and Southwest and Southern Virginia is not. And the localities cannot come up with so much money. It has to come from the state.
Well, and can I just explain how it works in most states? And I'm probably going to crosswalk the language wrong here for Virginia, but that's not uncommon. Scarsdale takes in a lot more local money than other places in New York. And the way most states are now structuring their formula is to say, we expect the local community to tax itself at a specific rate. So whatever it is, 3 mills or whatever, you raise that money and maybe another district barely raises anything off that same tax rate. And then the state levels up. So in Northern Virginia, there's barely going to get any state leveling up, and there's going to be a lot more leveling up in the other parts. That's exactly why Scarsdale gets almost no money from the state, and other districts are getting almost, like Poughkeepsie, almost all of their money from the state. So that's the model. When people say, how much would this cost? The technical answer is as much as you want to spend.
Let me ask you, follow up on that, Madam Chair. As much as you want to spend, from JR's look, what would be ideal in Virginia? How much more money should the state spend on the south side, Western Virginia? That's not spending, they can't raise but so much money.
Well, it's interesting. We didn't really set an ideal amount of money. What we did was we tried to figure out, okay, if you were to assess this formula against other things, what would you assess it against? And one of the things we did in chapter 2 of the report was compared the funding that's provided to a lot of different benchmarks, the national average, the regional average. We worked with some different groups to come up with 3 different set of benchmarks. And to varying degrees, the Virginia just amount in aggregate was below all of those to varying degrees. But the recommendations that I was talking about and the options that I was talking about, they're not really designed to produce a particular amount of money. They were just the result of making the formula more reflective of the various criteria. But I think your question is an important one, and I think it gets back to the conversation about, do we want to fund a particular level of outcome, or do we want to fund a particular set of student groups more than the others? And I think there's some guidance in what other states spend and what the models spend, and all those were higher than what Virginia is spending now.
Do you know how much?
On that, Virginia's, in Virginia, all in, how much the school divisions get per pupil? No one's yelling out numbers. So it's about 14 or 15,000 a kid. And that is around the national average right now, although it is lower than some of your states to the north, like New York and Maryland. So definitely, probably feels like a place where you could add more money. I just also want to warn you, because I can't talk in front of any group without warning them, that next September this September 2024 is the ESSER cliff. If you're not familiar with that, that's when the federal relief funds run out. That is when the highest poverty districts, especially because I got more money, are going to come to the legislature saying, what are you doing for us? Because we're going to cut a whole lot of staff. So if you were looking ahead to change your funding formula, coinciding with the catastrophic effects of the funding cliff from the federal relief funds, might not be a bad time. It's going to be really, really, really disruptive in your highest poverty districts.
Delegate Durant.
Thank you. I'm still, forgive me for some that's just wrapping my head around how its system works. So is it, with the current system we have, is there, with student enrollment, that stays with the school district, and that becomes more reportable if we have enrollment that fluctuates into a new school district? And how are we accounting for fluctuation in enrollment with this type of new student-based formula? I've got several questions. That's one of them. I guess, does it also affect some fluctuations also with administrative costs with different types of schools? And would that incentivize them with this type of formula, I guess, maybe less experienced teachers versus more experienced?
We haven't seen that in other
You haven't
states that have
seen that,
adopted that.
okay.
No, in fact, they're subject to the same sort of community pressures, whether their money is flexible or not.
Is, in terms of the weighting too, we've talked about some of the weights. Are we seeing different types of weighting applied across the Commonwealth, across the country? Is that still a work in progress in terms of student outcomes versus some of those examples that.
So they're not weighting student outcomes because that can be a disincentive, right? The worse outcomes you get, the more money you get. So they're really not. They're trying to weight characteristics of students. So we are seeing the standard ones are poverty, English language learners, foster kids, maybe kids who've been out of school for a while or are over age for their grade are common ones. You can't use race because that violates the Equal Protection Act. And lots of other people could comment on that. But rural students or geographic sparsity is a kind of an alternative for rural. And so those are the standard ones. But some very large districts are also using these formulas inside their district to pass the dollars along to their schools. And those are sometimes more nuanced, where they might see migrant students or other kinds of immigrant students get a weight for a year or things like that. So they're kind of responsive to what the need characteristics of are their students. And on the question of the enrollment changes, it's always the case that school districts gain and lose money when they gain and lose students. It's always the case, even in the current formula, because a district with 100,000 students has more money than a district with 10,000 students or 1,000 students, right? So it's always the case. And it is always really easy for districts to grow and always very hard for them to shrink, whether the shrinking is because students up and move to a district or because young people aren't having kids at the same rate that my generation did or whatever it is. It's always hard to have fewer students over time. But when a district has flexibility in its money, then it can choose how to shrink and maybe take advantage of attrition and in different kinds of ways to do that. So it's still hard, but theoretically smoother with the flexibility.
Our agenda says we're supposed to end now, but we're not going to. So we're, the list that we had going from memory was Senator Favola is next with questions, and then Delegate Tita, and then Delegate Simons. Did I miss anyone?
That is correct.
And Senator Barker. Okay.
No break.
Right. Thank you. I heard you say that there would be some local financial contribution in your formula. You made it sound as though each locality would sort of be contributing maybe the same percentage of the cost, but perhaps they'd have to apply a different tax rate.
No, the same tax rate.
So if it was the same.
Not the same percentage of cost, because
The same
that could be very, very different.
It would be. So follow up, Madam Chair, if it's the same tax rate, I mean, the tax rate in Northern Virginia would raise considerably more because of course the value of the property is higher. The assessments are higher. So the tax rate in Northern Virginia would raise more than the tax rate, say in King and Queen County or Southwest Virginia, Roanoke. That's okay, I guess, that under your formula, just based on the value of the property, there'd be a different amount of money going into each school system, right? And
No, so it doesn't create a different amount of money going into each school system. What it does is if you're a wealthy community and the state says you got to tax yourself at 3 mil or whatever the tax rate is, and they can generate 10,000 a kid from that, let's say you're aiming for 15,000 for every kid.
Sure.
They only get 5,000 from the state. If in another district, they only can generate 1,000 because it's like getting blood from a rock at that tax rate, then they would get the other 14,000 from the state. So what the state's money doing is leveling up to create that parity across communities, assuming a fixed tax rate in each community.
And how would you determine what that fixed tax rate is going to be? Because localities, I mean, that's a fairly political decision, which boards of supervisors wrestle with.
When you write a new formula, you can specify a rate. So what states often do is they say, this is the expected local contribution. You can make it mandatory or not. Those are the purview of legislatures to make it mandatory or not. This is what we expect you can collect. We'll give you the difference. And then you can have different policy for whether or not local communities want to add on even more money. But all across the country, that's generally the way it's done. In a few states, they'll say some of your local amount goes to the state and then goes back to the district. Politically, that is not as accepted as it stays in your district. People just hate the idea of sending their money to the state, even if they get it back. So if it feels like a local tax, there's less opposition to it. So even if the state is mandating, this is a local tax, it stays in your district, we're leveling up. That's kind of where it's been more stable across states.
One more question.
Okay, Senator Favola has one more question.
Thank
Let me give you the rundown again. Then it's Delegate Taylor, Simon, Senator Barker, and our new Chair of Senate Finance and Education. Oh, no, that's not you. No, that's me. The new Chair of Education and Health, Senator Hashmi, will have the last word.
Are you expecting localities to have two separate tax rates, one for schools and one for other things? Because in their tax rate, they're funding public safety, human services, a number of other,
Yeah, so
water
I would
treatment
say
plants.
across the country, different states handle that differently, whether it's one rolled up tax rate or the first 3 mils of whatever your tax rate is goes to the school. You can tax yourself a higher rate on top of that. They have different, because they have different constitutions, they have different ways of talking about that very issue. But generally, local communities raise some of their money for schools and some of their money for other stuff.
Delegate Tata. I was just curious to know if there are other states that have done a hybrid with the program and the student based on that.
Generally, the general thinking, yes, there are other hybrid one. Well, so California 10 years ago replaced it. And a lot of other states like Delaware would be in your camp is also in a constant state of trying to figure out how to replace it, and a few others. But I think the thinking is that it's the system they know now. They haven't had the politics of getting across the finish line, but it's also like an old computer that because we couldn't replace the computer, we just kept layering on different things and the whole thing doesn't work as well as it originally did. So if your goal is transparency, obviously the hybrid doesn't work at all for that. If it's for equity, that doesn't work because these different allocations compete with each other. If it's for having some school district flexibility, that doesn't work because people are constantly managing different streams of the money. So yes, there are other states do, and I can give you a printout of a map on which ones have that model. And I think it's in the JLARC report.
We've got a map that I can give you as well. I'm not sure we got as specific in terms of the hybrid term.
Okay.
But there's good information out there, I think, in terms of which states use what approach.
Tennessee was one, but they just replaced their model.
Delegate Simons.
So one of the things I really like about the student-based model is that it's more flexible depending on what the needs are of the school district. I was on the school board in Newport News when we had an influx of refugees, and if we had had money that followed the student, we would have been able to deal with that. Right now, many of us in the legislature are excited about the possibilities around career and technical education. We could have some money that followed the student around career and technical education. So as I look at the report and the near-term, long-term recommendations, I am a little bit confused because it almost seems some of the recommendations are about fixing the current bad formula. But then there are other recommendations that seem more about throwing out everything and starting anew. So can you give us your opinions on what, as legislators, we should be doing this next session? What's the timeline here? Should we bother? Should we waste time fixing a bad system? Or should we be studying and planning to blow it up and start anew?
Very good question. I think The first answer I'll give you is probably a frustrating one. I mean, it's really up to you. And part of the reason why the report has both those tones in it, it's really a decision that the General Assembly needs to make in terms of how they want to go about it. But in terms of some kind of practical advice, how to think about it, you know, I think a lot of the things that the professor's talking about will require some big discussion by a lot of people. Even this notion of how do you think about local ability to pay in a student-based formula. I mean, the thought that jumped into my head was, well, you can just apply the revenue capacity index to it, and maybe that's okay, maybe that's not. But I think it will take a lot of time. And our near-term recommendations, we made those near-term because we felt like, based on the work that we had done, those really should be implemented. So for example, continuing to get rid of the support cap, doing something to not use the 8-year-old measure of free and reduced lunch. And you know, that could be done soon. And that could maybe be the way to not continue with the current formula. But then at some point, I do think if there's a decision made to switch, you need to say, as of this date, we will switch. I also, in theory, there's an SOQ work group that's going to be doing some work. So that has to be put into the mix as well. But I think the way to think about it is our near-term recommendations, we felt like you can do those this session because the support cap from the Great Recession doesn't make a lot of sense. The outdated out-risk doesn't make a lot of sense. So that would be my way to think about it.
And I would just add that, so most states don't meaningfully alter their state funding formulas, but once in the 30 years. I don't know if I'd really bother with this, a lot of tinkering, just because if you're going to do it, you kind of go for broke, because if you do any major tinkering, you might be another 20 or 30 years before you do it. So that's just the historical picture of it. The other thing, it doesn't mean you have to blow it up. So let me just explain. The way other states have implemented a big new thing like this is they said, we know you got X amount of dollars last year. We're aiming to move you onto this formula. And so we're taking the new money in our system and we're applying it to those who are the furthest from the new calculation. You're not there yet, but we're filling in that difference as we go. You don't move wholesale. I mean, if you're in a district, money doesn't go away. You just get new money, and the new money goes on to the new formula, and you migrate onto that new formula with the available dollars you have. So it's really, the people in the districts don't feel any sort of explosion.
Senator Barker.
All right, I'll jump in here. I think, you know, it would be it seems to me it would be very, very difficult to make radical changes to how we're going to fund the systems within the Commonwealth. And it's because you're dealing with very different numbers and different situations across the Commonwealth. If you said we're going to have $11,000 per student or $15,000 per student, that might go well in far southwest Virginia and Lee County, which is tucked in between Tennessee and Kentucky, and the Greensville Emporia area, which is along the North Carolina border. While at the same time, you have, those are very, very low cost areas. To hire a teacher there is very, very different than hiring a teacher in Northern Virginia. Because in Northern Virginia, there's absolutely no way you could probably get enough teachers in any school within Arlington and Alexandria and Falls Church and places like that. If you paid the highest salary a teacher could possibly get in Greensville, Emporia, and in Lee County. And there's no way to do it to make it equitable. And what you also, and actually, interestingly, the way we have it now, you know, it's a lot of competition in terms of teacher salaries, but we have, even though we have very good performance overall, and we've been ranked number 4 nationally in a number of different categories on things in terms of output and how well the students do. But we have been, and actually just a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we were number 50 in the nation last in terms of adjusting or if you looked at teacher salaries and looked at salaries of other people who had similar abilities and responsibilities and education and all that. So that, you know, we were last, so we've not really solved that problem ourselves, but we're now moving a little bit on those types of things. The other thing is you talk about a fixed tax rate. In some of the urban areas, and that's in Northern Virginia, as well as some of the other areas in the Hampton Roads and Richmond areas, tax rates, property tax rates are over $1 per $100 of assessed value. We have a lot of rural jurisdictions that are basically 30 to 40 cents. So, you know, only 1/3. So it's not just because the value of the property is there. They don't tax it in ways to be able to bring in revenue. And to be able to put all those types of things all into one radical change in a formula there, I think would be very, very difficult. And just the three jurisdictions that I've been representing for a long time, Alexandria, Fairfax, and Prince William, they are three sizable jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, but they are very different among themselves. Alexandria, for a long time, nobody wanted to go to high school in Alexandria because there was not the investment that got put in. And finally, when the local government increased the compensation for the teachers and addressed some of the issues, they've now made very substantial increases in terms of performance of their students. In Prince William County, it's one of the two counties that's, if you're moving out from DC to Arlington, Alexandria, then to Fairfax, and then to Loudoun and Prince William, even between Loudoun and Prince William, what we have is a situation where, because Prince William was developed with low-income housing, very modest income housing, whereas Loudoun has not been, went much more aggressively to upper income things. And also they had in effect, if you couldn't get a job in Prince William County, so you have to drive out of Prince William County to go to Pentagon, to Tyson's Corner, to DC, all those types of things. And so therefore they did not have the tax revenue to be able to address these issues. And it's only been in the last couple of years that they've started making some progress with salaries for their teachers and those types of things. And the performance is showing, both in terms of graduation rates as well as the test scores that the students have. So I think we need to, if we're ever going to do this, we need to be able to do it in a way that we're having comparable situations in terms of where students would be able to advance as well as they could around, regardless of where they lived. And that's one of the things that I think is very significant. I can tell you that I grew up in Tennessee, and it was not a hot spot for education. When I was there, there were not a whole lot of things that the time I got to college, I was in classes with people who had been in the New Yorks and the Massachusetts and those types of things, and they were able to had already developed the skills and learned a lot from their high school classes, which none of them were offered where I grew up. So.
Thank you.
So can I just respond that?
Sure.
And
we're running overtime, and Senator Hosmer wants to have last word without a break. We're already into the next hour, but you go on with your remarks.
I want to say that if you're trying to improve the finance formula in Virginia, I would recommend signing up for, this might sound self-serving, but our certificate in ed finance course, because we address every one of those issues that you mentioned, including the tax differential and the performance of kids in the eastern side of Virginia. You can dig in on the data in it. And I would also point out that for a long time, Virginia has been known as one of the stronger states academically across the country and is very much slipping out of that pool. And Tennessee is very much in the last couple of years rising, seeing a positive trend. So I just would be cautious about that. We have a lot of data that can help talk about these trends more in real time. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in seeing how to get the most from Virginia's money, to come participate in that program.
Senator Hashmi, and then Delegate Rasul, you need to move right into your introduction as quickly as possible.
Moving locations. We gotta get up.
That's right, we gotta get up and move, so that's gonna take a couple of minutes too. So, Senator Hashmi.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I will not belabor the point, and thank you very much to our panelists. Clearly, this is going to be probably the topic of focus, one of the major priorities that we have this session. I just want to make one quick comment, if I may. And we understand, Dr. Rosa, that the use of race cannot be a factor in weighting the funding formula. But one thing I would ask all of us to collectively do is to consider the ways in which systemic racism continues to play a role in our students' lives and student achievement. So while it may not factor into the funding formula directly, understanding the issues around implicit, explicit bias, systemic structures that are in place that continue to impact student success in certain ways is a concern that we ought to keep in mind. But thank you very much to the panelists today.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for that important insight on funding. We are now going to invite our legislators to transition downstairs for small group conversations with local educators and school leaders from here in Virginia to dive into the topic of learning loss and ways in which our schools and their leadership continues to grapple with this important topic. Members of the public, this concludes your participation in today's meeting. If you are joining us for the public meeting tomorrow, we welcome you to join us at Chesterfield Recovery Academy. That programming will start at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Legislators, please take everything with you downstairs at this time. And we will start in 2 minutes, 2:05, room 205, and Hunt staff will help direct you. Thank you.
You want us to take our name cards?
Can leave it. Thank you.